This is the Future X podcast. In each episode, we interview a platform designer, author, or publisher. They'll talk about how to build online communities that are diverse, welcoming, and safe. Now, here's our host, Lee Schneider.
This is the Future X podcast. I'm Lee Schneider. In today's episode, you'll meet Dr. Rob Eschmann, a writer, scholar, filmmaker, and educator from Chicago. He is an associate professor of social work and a member of the Data Science Institute at Columbia University, as well as a faculty associate at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. His new book, When the Hood Comes Off, Racism and Resistance in the Digital Age, is a comprehensive study of how racism manifests online, and it highlights the anti-racist tactics rising to oppose it. He blends deep research with personal stories. It's a great read. Dr. Eschmann, thanks for joining me on the show today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So how are online experiences with racism different from in-person experiences?
You know, I think in person, what has happened, and if we think about racism before the classical civil rights movement, or before Jim Crow ended, and it was open, it was in your face, it was legal, and so people could be, they didn't have to hide racism. It was the law of the land, and it was seen as being normal and natural. But after the legal changes from the classical civil rights movement, and racism and discrimination, is now illegal. If you say something openly racist, you may be able to get fired from your job. You can get in trouble, right? And so that means that the language that people use to describe racial differences or to express racism has changed. It has moved from being overt to being more subtle to being more covert. And so the norm, the things that we experience in mainstream situations, it is the normal way of expressing racism is through more, subtle type of interactions. And what happens online is that people feel less of a need to be subtle with their racism. That because of anonymity, there's a perceived distance between the things you do online and real life consequences. And then we also know that there's something called the online disinhibition effect, and just not looking a human in the eye and communicating with them online, people tend to become more hostile. And this is in all types of discussions, not just talking about race, but when you put this kind of online disinhibition effect and increased hostility, and you combine it with discussions about race, things tend to get ugly. So I think online expressions or overtly hostile expressions of racism are a lot more common. And this for many people is a big change and shift in the way that they experience racism. And for scholars and people who think about racism, it's just a different form of racism than we thought, right? That most people thought they were dealing with in the 21st century.
So I want to link this to geography and the geography-free aspect of online communication. It's my bias that I would think, people in the South are racist and people in the North are not. I know that's a ridiculous statement, but it's something that I could, if I just did a snap judgment, I might think that. It's interesting to me to hear you say that there's been a progression, and I want to know if I'm hearing this right. There's been a progression from overt to more covert racism. Mm-hmm. Did I hear that right? In the real world.
You did. So in the 1940s, 90% of people would say, yes, I think that interracial marriage should be banned. In the 2000s, only about 5% of people would say, yes, I think interracial marriage should be banned. And so this is a big change in a measured racial attitude. And so there are different ways of interpreting that. Some people would see that as just being progress. It means people are less racist. But I think other folks who are sociologists and think deeply and critically about racism think that racism has not gone away. It's just people are better at filling out surveys. They know not to click the wrong answer, which is the racist answer. And so then it becomes a struggle for, activists, educators, scholars to figure out how do we identify racism when it's being hidden, when it's masked. And so I think that is something that lots of people have figured out very smart ways to do over the last half century. In terms of location online, right, to get to your question, that is a very interesting point. And I think that a lot of times when we see racism online, we can rationalize it away, and we can say, oh, that maybe this is someone in the KKK who's hiding in the YouTube comments, but that doesn't reflect the real world. They are the ones who are in a bubble. But then there are other examples of things happening where online racism is unmasked, and then we realize, oh no, it's right where we live. And so one example of that, in chapter 4 of my book, actually, I do a case study of a college campus where there was a website that students would post on anonymously, but in order to post on the website, you had to be connected to the university. And so you had to have that .edu email address. The moderators had to accept your comment and then post them anonymously. And what ended up happening is that you have all kinds of horrific, racist, and homophobic content that's being posted online, but your students were unable to say, oh, these are from the racists in the South, who the stereotypical assumption we would make about racists. Oh, these are people who are ignorant or uneducated or backwards. But no, these are people from the same college that I'm going to school with. These are my peers who are making the kind of statements that I would assume belong someplace else geographically, but really are a part of my community. And so this is an incident that really changed the way that a lot of folks of color thought about racism on campus, because it revealed that these attitudes that had been hidden and that were thought to have died were really alive and strong. But he had folks who felt like they couldn't say these things out loud, but they had not changed the way that they thought about those things. And
this is because of anonymity, you think? And not just you think, but the research shows, because of anonymity and the context and the sort of contextlessness of online life. Is that the why behind this, or something else is going on?
Yeah. So part of that, I'm sensing a deeper question of like, where does the racism come from? And I'm not going to say that the racism just comes from anonymity, but I think that there are key differences that different social settings could make it normal for people to behave in different ways. So if you go to school or you work at a job in a place where you would get in trouble for saying racist things, you won't say those things. But then if you are in a space where you feel safe around some friends who you think share the same values, then you may say something different than how you behave in public. And that right there's a study of this. It's called two-faced racism theory, where college students were given journals and they were told to write down different conversations that they had throughout the day. And it was found that people talk about race very differently in public versus in private. So on the front stage, they have kind of a public-facing way of being and way of talking about race. But in private, when they felt more safe, then that's when the racist jokes come out. That's when their true feelings about politics or different social things in the news come out. And so absolutely feeling separated from the norms that make overt racism, taboo in everyday life, feeling separated from them online can provide a context where people feel more comfortable expressing racist views, or there's other research on white supremacist groups organizing online, and so people who have this hidden racism that they can't talk about, they may go online and look for communities where people think like them and where they can feel like, oh, okay, I'm not crazy, that this is something that is a logical way of viewing the world, and finding more support for those problematic beliefs.
So what I'm hearing, there's really a lot going on here. There's the one point is white supremacist groups can find like-minded people and feel comfortable in that environment to express more overtly racist views. And there's also just the way the online world is, where there's a lack of eye contact, there's less decreased empathy. You feel like you could say even the bad things that are held in your heart, but you can kind of let them out. Do I have that right?
This is something that lots of people have experienced and understand about the internet, that things can get nasty. And part of what I try to do in the book is really understand what are the consequences of these changes. So I do talk about the causes of the changes. What is it that makes online discussions of race and in-person discussions of race so different? But then I also want to think about the consequences. How does this affect people? How does it affect their mental health? How does it affect the way that they view the world? How does it affect the way that they think about their peers? And so, in talking with students, so I interview 86 students from around the country, and those stories the students tell me really drive kind of the book and really help us understand what these changes in racial discourse mean for regular everyday people.
I should say that and take a pause here to say how wonderful the book is in blending your personal stories, stories of your students, the research. It's totally absorbing, worth the read to connect all those things. And you do a great job of that.
Thank you.
Just wanted to bring that in, and so I didn't let that zoom by us.
I worked very hard where the research behind this book is very robust, but I worked very hard to not write it as an academic book. I did not want this to just be something that only, people in academia or other scholars wanted to read. And so I worked very hard to make it something that was accessible and hopefully fun and interesting to read, a call to action, but then also is, based on some of the most rigorous methods that we have. So from interviews to surveys to doing social media analytics at a large scale.
Yeah, great. It really shows too. It's wonderful. I want to talk about the concept of color blindness, because what some listeners may be thinking is, hey, wait a minute. I thought, we elected a black president. We don't see color anymore. We're okay. We're okay now. But the message coming through in your book and some others that I've read recently, and Ibram Kendi's work and lots of other books that are, from 2020 on really, and maybe before, they start to talk about, there's an institutional racism that's always been there. And in the white world, we thought, we figured that out. If we just don't talk about it, if we just don't refer to race at all, everything is fine. And you talk about that in these other books I've mentioned. White Fragility talks about that, other books. So just to be clear on this, has the internet brought out this terrible cancer of racism all over again? Or has it always been there and now we are able to see it either through discovery of white supremacist groups or the existence of Black Twitter or other ways of seeing what maybe the white world didn't see as well?
Absolutely. It is something that has always been there. It's not something that is only coming out because of the internet. Mm-hmm. It is being revealed because of the internet. So something that I talk about in the book is masked racism and the ways that racism is embedded in everyday institutions, policies, programs, and interactions, but without many people being able to see it. And when I say many people, I think that folks of color who are on the receiving end of racism, we notice subtle racism. I think that people who study racism, people who teach about racism, lots of people know where racism has been living while it's been subtle, but it's been masked, and other people may not have the same ability to kind of see through the subtlety. And now we have this unmasking of racism online, which means now people are able to see what was there, right? Police violence against black people existed before there was a video, right before there were videos of black folks being hurt and killed by police that would go viral. And so this is something that was known in our community for decades, that things have been happening. We think about the Black Panther Party originated as following around police to make sure that kids in the neighborhood weren't getting beat up. And so this is something that has been happening that we have known about, but has become, when it goes viral, then people who don't have this as their everyday reality are able to see, the world is not as I thought that it was. And that's how you get many more people kind of on the anti-racist bandwagon of and I don't use that term in a negative way. I mean that in terms of people who want to start fighting racism because they only just realize that it is still around. So absolutely, racism has been there. In terms of color blindness and this idea that I don't see color, and if we don't talk about it, then it won't be a problem. So this is a problematic way of thinking about what it means to be anti-racist, is to think that it necessitates being colorblind, because what happens is, silence is racism's best friend. Mm-hmm. If we don't talk about racism, then we don't know that it's there. Right? So if we decide that it is taboo to have conversations about racism, then the folks of color who are being hurt by racism don't have an opportunity to share about their experiences, which means that things stay the same. And so this is one of the things that, so the book, it's called When the Hood Comes Off, Racism and Resistance in the Digital Age. So the racism is one piece, but the other piece is how are folks of color using digital tools to challenge racism in new and innovative ways. And one of those ways are breaking the silences. So the most common, so microaggressions is kind of a buzzword now. It refers to subtle forms of racism. The most common way that the research says to respond to microaggressions is just to not respond. right? So silence is the norm. And what happens when you're silent in the face of a microaggression? It means that everyone around thinks that that is an okay way to behave. They think that this subtle racist joke is fine. No one needs to challenge it. They don't realize that this is causing harm, that experiences with microaggressions have negative health impacts on folks of color. And but if you think about what happens online, and one of the things I talk about in chapter 5 is this new, right, when students share the ways that they respond to microaggressions online versus in person, and looking at some of those differences, that students online feel much more comfortable challenging microaggressions, talking back to microaggressions. And this is a communal project. It's a collective project. So it's never the responsibility of one person to speak out, but it's if anyone in the community has the energy that day, then they're able to support everyone by saying no thank you to these harmful interactions. And so I think that this idea of color blindness and not seeing color as being the solution is problematic. And what it really does, it legitimates kind of the way that racist systems do harm to communities of color. And only through challenging colorblind interpretations of the law, of that we treat people differently in society, that only through challenging colorblind interpretations are we able to reveal how racism works, the hidden mechanisms of racism, and then work to fix the way that our system provides unequal treatment and opportunities based on the color of our skin.
Thank you. That's a great explanation. And that leads me into the notion of online communities, and specifically Black Twitter. I hadn't really thought about the pervasiveness of online communities that can really call out other communities. It was something I hadn't really thought about, I have to say. And I spend a lot of time online and think about being online a lot. So first of all, online communities like Black Twitter, what is or was Black Twitter?
Well, definitely not was. It's still, Black Twitter is still here.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah. So Black Twitter is, and I take my definitions from Andre Brock, Trusty Cottom, Mark Lamont Hill, and Black Twitter is a space where Black folk get together and perform Blackness online, and that can part of that is going to be challenging racism and highlighting ways that racism is pervasive in society. Another part of that is just collectively enjoying popular culture, and so the hashtags from Black Lives Matter to Say Her Name to Thrones Y'all, which is about the Game of Thrones TV show, all come out of Black Twitter. And so, you have this kind of wide range of things that comes out of Black Twitter. There was some concern of what would happen when Elon took over Twitter. And I think that, there is research that showed some spikes in the use of racist language after, Elon took over. But I don't think that will stop Black Twitter, because Black Twitter and before Black Twitter, other online Black communities, Black folks have been figuring out ways to use technology to engage in the sharing of counter narratives for a long time. So before Twitter existed, there were Black bloggers who were challenging dominant understandings of social policies online, and it will continue even if they were locked out of Twitter. But they're not locked out of Twitter. I think Twitter is unique among the social network or blogging platforms, because for a while Jack Dorsey was very interested. I mean, you think about this, because Black Lives Matter is the most used hashtag of all time on Twitter, right? Jack Dorsey seemed to be interested in creating tools that would help Black activists use social media, that would benefit them, starting with the organizing in Ferguson on. And that seemed like it was a unique, where the people at the top wanted to support the movement. But even if the people at the top don't want to support the movement, the people still have access to the platform and are going to be able to use it in a way that does support the movement for Black lives. And so I don't think that Elon taking over is going to kill Black Twitter. Black Twitter is alive and well. I learn from Black Twitter all the time, and I think it's something that has given voice to marginalize folks who do not have voice everywhere. And I think that has been huge in terms of changing the national, vocabulary and ways that we understand racism and how it works, and the ways that we decide to get together and challenge racism.
What about this idea of marginalized communities finding a voice on social media? It seems incredibly important, and there have been revolutions in the world. There have been, dictatorships have been overthrown, and also racism has been called out, and we've seen more instances of racism. There's been more of a public reporting of racism, especially online. I assume there's no downside to that. Yes, it's all good?
Well, let me answer the first part before answering whether it's all good. But one of the key differences with social media versus other mainstream forms of media is the gatekeepers. With kind of traditional forms of media, you have institutional gatekeepers that decide what stories are told, who gets a voice. And historically, black folks of color, are not given a voice all the time. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is kind of the strategy, that one of the strategies of organizers during the classical civil rights movement was to get the attention of traditional media outlets, to get them to tell their story. And that when you had videos of dogs attacking, peaceful protesters and people being hit with fire hoses, that these are things that had a big impact on the way folks, not just in the country but around the world, thought about America and our and its policies. And but to some extent, folks were dependent on traditional media outlets deciding to tell the story. That the things that were happening had not changed, but they one day decided, okay, we'll air this. One thing that we see with social media is that organizers and activists don't have to wait for gatekeepers to allow them to share their narrative. That they can use social media to share it immediately and to large effect. And so one of the studies that I like to cite is by a friend of mine, Jacob Groshek, where they found that during the organizing in Ferguson, the biggest hubs for information sharing were black activists on the ground, not traditional media outlets. And so that really shows a shift in power where black folks, black Twitter, black activists are forcing the issue. They force things into the national conversation when mainstream media or traditional media outlets may prefer, no, let's be colorblind. And then activists are able to say, no, we're not going to be colorblind. And here's why. And it just puts more power in the people's hands that we can decide what goes viral. We can decide what to bring attention to. And I think that has been huge in terms of bringing racism to the attention of people around the world who did not know it was as big of a problem as it is. Now, the second part of your question, is this all good? I don't know if I could say it's all good, because I think that social media has the power to amplify marginalized voices, but that can also be marginalized voices for evil. And that's part of, this kind of, this far right extremist, groups are becoming more visible. And part of that is that they are also taking advantage of social media technologies and that small groups of people can have a big voice. And I think that, so I think that you see both sides of the coin there, where on one, that marginalized groups, communities of color are able to use technology to amplify their voices, but so are racists. Now, the question is this an equal push and pull? And what I argue in my book is it is not an equal push and pull, because racism, needs silence in order to survive. In a society where we think racism is bad, it's easier to maintain racist policies when no one realizes that they're racist. And so, my perspective is that the more we see racism, the more people are going to want to fight against it.
Thinking about communities online a little bit more deeply, and this is kind of an awkward question for me to ask as a white person, but it came up as I was reading the book, and I want to have a go at it, and you should tell me if I go off track or anything. But according to your research and according to your personal experiences, how do people of color respond differently, or do they respond differently to racism in person versus online?
So this is one of the, So I got into this a little bit in terms of thinking about responding to microaggressions is that in person there are different barriers to responding to microaggressions. The racism may happen so quickly that you didn't realize it was racism until you talk with a friend about it afterwards. You may not know how to respond. You may be scared of the social or physical consequences of responding. That you may feel unsafe in responding. You may feel like you would lose a friend if someone thinks that you are too sensitive or too militant, taking a joke too seriously. And so there are all these reasons that keep people from speaking out when they experience racism in person. Online, one of the key differences that we have kind of a different setting that these interactions take place in that negate a lot of the reasons why people don't want to respond in person. So this not knowing what to say, that someone else can say it for you. If it's done in a public, if this is kind of you're responding to racism that's done in a public setting on a Facebook wall, on social media, in a comment, then someone else who sees it can be the one to challenge that racism. If you're not sure if it was racist or not, and you want to go talk to someone about it, timing works differently, where this is in person, conversations happen in real time. Online, someone can take 10 minutes to calm themselves down, to think about what happened, and then really, really put thought into their response. And you may not have that time in person, right? And so I think that there are different opportunities that online communication provides for responding to racism that are that really change the dynamics, and even power structures that whereas folks of color may feel a sense of fear of responding in person, online the racists can't attack them, so they can say something back. And then online you also have this shift in power where when you have a community of people who are responding to racism, that they can put pressure on racists or on folks who engage in an act of racism in a way that person may not feel pressure in the real world when they are backed by mainstream institutions. And so online, the black folks can put pressure on people to realize, hey, you got to get your act together because we don't think that what you just did was appropriate.
This might be a good time to bring in the digital dualism fallacy, because and this is a concept that I've read about in your book and from a researcher. We've been talking a lot about how the online world and the real life world are different, and they're different environments. But they're also kind of a mix, kind of a messy mix, kind of a augmented reality where these lives are overlapping quite a bit.
I think, some people would say that, things that happen online are not real. These are not real people. These are not real conversations. What matters are the things that happen in the real world. And then you get online researchers who study the real world and who study things online and study the effects of things that happen online on real world outcomes, from mental health to educational outcomes, et cetera. And so I think that this idea of augmented reality comes from an understanding of these are not two distinct worlds where we take a break from real life to go live in our online world, that our lives are mixed. These things come together. And that is that's part of the reason why I started the study on a college campus, is because I see this as being a place to really study the augmented reality of race and racism, where when you post something on Sunday night, the people in your class on Monday likely have seen it. College students tend to be friends across different boundaries. And so I think that means that we're able to really analyze and understand the connection between online behaviors and incidents and real world behaviors and incidents, physical world behaviors and incidents, and seeing the ways that they are really connected. And so I do, so in terms of me going different places to get data to tell the story of this book, this is why I talk to people about their experiences in the physical world, about their experiences online. But I also do Twitter analysis of millions of tweets over a decade to look and see some of the things that I found through interviews. How did they play out online, and how have things changed over time? And so I think that really wanting to tell a story about our augmented reality is the reason why I have these varied data sources in order to be responsible in the way that I'm talking about and thinking about how online communication changes the way that we experience, understand, and respond to racism.
We've talked a little bit about activism And the latter part of the book talks a lot about activism. And I just want to be sure we've covered the best stuff. Are there more examples of the ways that activists can use online media to incite change and educate people?
I think there's been a lot written on the large-scale activism online, from the big hashtags to how online organizing is connected to activism in the real world. So the uprisings in 2020 really showed that when you have 500,000 people marching on June 6th. And I think that story is something that's been told, and that is a part, right? I do talk about it some in the book, but I really wanted to focus less on the large-scale events that I think we have a good understanding of, and more on how does online communication change how regular, everyday people engage with racism online. And so one thing that I found is that lots of young people, through just replying to racism online, through learning about racism online, develop activist identities where they see the work of responding to racism and challenging racism, not in a way that the world sees it through a hashtag, but just in a way that their friends see it. They see that as a form of activism that changes how their communities think about racism, and really start to change the norms of what are the types of things that are acceptable in our community, and that students are, taking control of those things. And if administrators won't give it to them, then they take it for themselves, and creating, systems of kind of informal consequences for saying racially problematic things on campus when students don't get in trouble for it, but online there may be social consequences. And so I think that that is part of the story I tell, is that we see these large-scale events, what is happening on the ground, and really looking at the way that people's lives are changing through different forms of online activism, and how that not only is connected to traditional forms of civic engagement, but then also is challenging and maybe extending some of the ways that we think about activism among young people.
What I'm hearing is there's a lot of value in these small course corrections, these constant feedback loops, and they don't have to be the big hashtags. They can be smaller, everyday things. Yes?
That's right. I think that the way I like to think about that is subtle, everyday forms of racism are like scaffolding that upholds white supremacy. And the more that we challenge those things, the more we're dismantling the kind of the understandings, the justifications of an unjust system. And I think that that I don't think interpersonal challenges to racism are enough. I think that racism is systemic, and we need to think about societal level changes. But I think that when that there's a definite impact of folks speaking out in person, and those kind of everyday forms of activism interpersonally, and how they affect the people around you, and how they affect the rationales for subtle forms of racist behaviors. So one of the things we found is that when people witness someone else respond to racism, that can reduce the harm that racism has on their mental health outcomes, from depression, anxiety, and feelings of stress. And so these are things that have a protective impact on your community when you decide to challenge racism. And every time you challenge racism, again, so one of the forms of organizing that we talk about is transformative organizing, which is about changing the way that people view the world and introducing new and radical possibilities for how the world might be different. And so, part of these activist efforts are transformative, that people change the way that they think about race and racism. That I had one student say that, she used to be Stacey Dash, and now she's Fight the Power. And it's this idea of, through engaging in online, taking in online materials about race and racism, really changing your consciousness and the way that you think about race in the world.
That's positive, and that's wonderful in that way. There's so much really to talk about in this book. It's so rich, and we've really barely scratched the surface in our 37-minute interview. I'm wondering if there's anything else that we should cover now that you'd like to talk about.
This is a moment where we need to be thinking about how technology, impacts the conversations that we have about race and racism. I think things are changing very rapidly. So from attacks on critical race theory, or really just talking about race in schools, to continued organizing efforts to stop anti-Black police violence. I think that we are living in a time where these problems are front and center, and they're out in the open. And this is a moment of truth for us as a society to decide what way to go when the racists are, seemingly, starting to tell us when they're racist, as opposed to hiding it the way that they have been for a long time. And so I think that we have lots of work to do, but I am optimistic that as more people, see what racism looks like, that more people will join the fight.
The name of the book is When the Hood Comes Off. It's an amazing book. Please get it. You can find it on Amazon and at the University of California Press. And where can people find you, Professor, online?
I'm on Twitter at Rob Eschmann, and I'm on Instagram at rob.eschmann.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining me today on the podcast. This was great.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for joining us on the Future X podcast. Listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, Google, or anywhere fine podcasts appear in your feed. Post a comment on Apple Podcasts, and we'll read it on the show. For more info about Future X, visit futurex.studio.